And to talk more about the country's first African-American president's policy, we're now joined live from Washington, D.C. by Adam Kokesh, an activist with the Iraq Veterans Against the War organization. Hello, Mr. Kokesh. Thanks for joining us. Now, you've been at Obama's inauguration, as we know. Will the new U.S. administration actually bring the change, as they say?
Well, I listened to a speech that Biden gave at the DNC where he kept talking about McCain's policies and saying, that's not change, that's more of the same. Well, if you really look closely at all of the Obama administration's proposed policies, they really don't represent any kind of significant change. There's a proposed drawdown and privatization of the occupation of Iraq, which is actually very similar to what Bush was talking about towards the end of his term. And what we see is the same destructive interventionist foreign policy, including a surge in Afghanistan.
So, do you think President Obama should withdraw U.S. troops from Iraq immediately?
Absolutely. But more importantly than the physical act of withdrawing the troops is the immediate ending of the occupation. And that can actually happen with a single presidential order, because the occupation, that is to say, the forceful interference with Iraqi sovereignty, is contingent upon the way that the U.S. forces are using force itself in this occupation. And a number of the other presidential candidates spoke about immediately ceasing combat operations. And that's very important. And once you do that, you can begin the process of physically withdrawing the troops and handing over the facilities that are being occupied immediately.
Now, you've just mentioned this troop surge and occupation. Now, they say this troop surge is making Iraq a safer place. So you don't agree with that, do you?
Well, the surge was just more of the same, and frankly, the only reason it's even known as the surge is because it was propagandized as such. There were actually a number of surges between the end of the war, May 1st, 2003, and the surge of last year. And none of the increases in troop levels have done anything to change Iraqi opinion about the American forces over there. You know, the so-called success of the surge is really the success of a new propaganda device and having quelled a lot of the general disdain and distaste for this war that has gone on for far too long.
Now, Mr. Kokesh, let's now switch to Afghanistan. You are obviously critical about that, but does this policy in Afghanistan, is it any better in comparison to that of in Iraq?
Well, I was talking to one of your producers. I think they asked about a winning strategy in Afghanistan. Is the surge a winning strategy? And we have to remember, what we're talking about here is an occupation. And an occupation is not a war. And there are no winners because everybody just loses in an occupation. Now, we have been propagandized into believing that our government is conducting some larger war on terror and thus been bullied into supporting these occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as Obama has, supporting the strikes in Pakistan even. But terrorism is a crime, and it should be pursued as criminals, or terrorists should be pursued as criminals. And you don't need to occupy foreign countries to pursue terrorists.
And in your opinion, do these overseas wars fuel anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States as well?
Well, I'm not an expert on Muslim sentiment, but when I was in Fallujah, we paid Salacia payments. What we thought was very benevolent of us to pay for compensation for families of those that had been killed by accident or deliberately during the siege of Fallujah in 2004. And we paid those families $2,500 for their dead relatives, compared to my automatic life insurance through the military, which was $400,000. And I think we're sending some very clear messages by the way these occupations are being conducted and the lack of respect for sovereignty of Muslim countries, that we really don't value life over there. And we're continuing to send that message every day that we have troops occupying this country.
Apart from those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, what do you think should be changed in U.S. foreign policy in general? Should Obama, for instance, make friends with Iran, a country that, as we know, has had hostile relations with the U.S. for almost 3 decades now?
Well, speaking on my own behalf, the kind of real change that I'd like to see in our foreign policy is a return to the principles of our founding fathers in this country, and that is one of non-interventionism, or as George Washington himself said, trade and commerce with all nations and entangling alliances with none. And there's no more worse entanglement than occupation of foreign countries, which is, by and large what our policy is dominated by right now in terms of a strategy and sanctions and bullying other countries. But in terms of Iran specifically, we should seek, at least over the long term, to get back to a friendly diplomatic relationship in which we have free trade and commerce with them, as with any other country. But most importantly, in order to do that, we need to stop fighting proxy wars against Iran, such as in Palestine, where we're fueling one side of that by funding the Israelis to the tune of $40 billion a year. Now, that's just speaking on my own behalf about what I'd like to see reformed in our foreign policy. But clearly, in Iraq Veterans Against the War, we're calling for an end to the occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan and believe that those are really urgent, immediate reforms that can happen immediately and are a priority for us.
Well, thank you very much for your opinion. That was Adam Kokesh, an activist with Iraq Veterans Against the War organizations. Thank you very much for your opinion, Mr. Kokesh.